Thanks for joining us again at Gentleman's Journal Live. Here is a talk which I personally, of course, am hugely interested in, with the man who made one of, I think, the greatest print products in the world, The Week, and has also now made one of my favorite newsletters, The Knowledge. But before that, worked in newspapers for The Times, for the Sunday Telegraph, a proper newspaperman. Who's got some amazing stories and is still doing some very, very interesting things. So he's going to talk to us all about the future of media as it was and media as hopefully it might be. This is, of course, Jon Connell. Thank you very much for being here, Jon. Let's have a round of applause. That's a good way to start. So yeah, thanks very much for everyone for being here. Let's start with the sort of state of media right now. It's a scary topic, talking about media. Everyone is very, very down on it. We were listening to Tina Brown the other day, essentially saying that new media is not a thing anymore. Where's your sort of stance on the health of media at this moment in time?
Well, I don't think newspapers are in good shape, obviously. And print products, there'll be a slow decline. I suspect niche products, like Gentleman's Journal, like The Spectator, I think they'll have a much longer life than newspapers. The main problem is that more and more people want to watch stuff and listen to stuff. So I think fewer and fewer read. And also the problem is that people's attention span has got shorter. You read now that many children are told in school that they say in school they can't possibly read long books. And James Merritt has a piece in the Times today about how this whole TikTok and YouTube mentality is affecting our capacity to analyze things properly and to think deeply. And I think that is a problem for media generally, is that everything seems to be so sort of transient now. And I struggle with The Knowledge because you're competing against so many other newsletters, but you're also competing against podcasts and videos. Absolutely.
So can you take us back to when it was very different, back to the sort of heyday, I suppose, of newspapers in the 70s and 80s? What are your memories from that time?
Well, it's like going back to the Stone Age, to think about it. And literally, newspapers were done on a stone. And one used to go down and check how the print looked on a stone downstairs in the Sunday Times. I started on the Press and Journal in Aberdeen after leaving university in 1975. I worked there for 2 years, and then I managed to worm my way into the Sunday Times, basically by doing. But I went down to London and I met one or two of their journalists in a pub called the Blue Lion in Gray's Inn Road, opposite the Sunday Times, and we had a few drinks. It was a Saturday evening, and they said, "Oh, you should try and get a job here. There's a job of chief sub at Business News going on the Sunday Times. Why don't you apply?" So I rang up Peter Harding, who was the managing editor of Business News, and he said, "Come over now." So having had a couple of pints, I stumbled across the road, and he said, So you're applying for this job, so how much do you know about business?" And I said, "Nothing at all." And he said, "How much do you know about subbing?" And I said, "Nothing at all." So he said, "Well, you're not really suited to this job, but if you want to leave the Press and Journal and come down, I'll find you some freelance work." So I went back up, and my editor, who was called Peter Watson, was a very practical guy, and in those days, these local papers and the Times were all owned by the Thomson organization. And I said, "Peter, I know I'm supposed to be here for fully 2 years, but I've had this sort of semi-offer." So he said, "Oh, well, you might as well take it." So I wrote saying, "I'll accept it." And the next day I bumped into Peter Watson again. He said, "By the way, don't you think perhaps you should get them to put it in writing if you're going to the Sunday Times?" And I said, "Yes." So I wrote saying, "Could you possibly put it in writing?" And I got a letter back instantly. "Dear Mr. Connell, there is no job on the Sunday Times and isn't likely to be for a very long time. Peter Harding has been taken into hospital. Yours sincerely, Kenneth Fleet, Editor-in-Chief, Sunday Times Business News." So what did I do? I told my editor in Aberdeen that I was going to leave. I'd had this letter saying there was no job, so I chucked it in anyway. And I think one of the things about journalism, certainly in those days, is there was no real career path. You had to kind of make your opportunities and just take risks. So I went down to London and stayed with friends and managed to spirit myself into the office. Peter Harding was back and wrote pieces about local radio in the business news. And eventually I met the news editor, who was called Magnus Linklater, who still does a column on the Times sometimes. And I said I'd heard that the Observer were chasing a story on corruption in Blackpool by the local council. And I said, I think I can beat the Observer to it. You know, confidence of a 24-year-old. So I ended up spending 6 weeks in Blackpool, staying in a little sort of equivalent of B&B. And I managed to get the story, and I managed to expose the corruption. And they sent their chief reporter, Will Ellsworth-Jones, up to meet me in a hotel, and we wrote the piece. And then I got back to London, into the office, a call from the editor's secretary to come and see Harry Evans, who was the legendary editor of the Sunday Times. And he said, okay, John, I'll give you a job. I'm going to pay you as little as I possibly can. I think it was 20,000 a year. But I'm sure you'll be back asking for more. So that was my introduction to the Sunday Times. And it was extraordinarily different to now, thinking about it. Newspapers were really taken very seriously. There were a whole group of people sitting on the 6th floor in the Sunday Times who appeared to me to turn out a piece once a month, and the paper would be lucky to get that. And it was, I suppose, looking at it now, slightly overstaffed. But it did produce great journalism. There was a real passion for it, and people bought it in huge numbers. And somehow it just kind of all worked. So I suppose I was a reporter for a little while, and then I worked on Insight for a while, and then eventually I managed to become defense correspondent of the Sunday Times. Is this interesting? Is it?
Yes, I know. Please, carry on.
So, in a way, I'm talking you through my career because it does sort of illustrate how the world has changed and how things worked in those days. So there I am, writing for Insight, which was, again, something which was plenty of resources were put into. I spent 6 weeks in Spain chasing drug smugglers for Insight, and I helped do 2 books, one on the Iranian embassy siege, one on the Falklands, with them. And I just don't think that kind of commitment and money would be spent now. It just wouldn't. And so anyway, the defense correspondent of the Sunday Times in those days was called Tony Geraghty, and he wrote a book called Who Dares Wins, since sort of updated by my old friend Ben McIntyre, who's turned into a very successful TV series. And he, wanting to write this book, resigned as defense correspondent. So someone said, why don't you apply to me? So I did apply. And so Harry had left, and the editor was now somebody called Frank Giles, his deputy. And Frank summoned me up to see him, and he said, John, I don't quite know what to do, because I've got you, who knows quite a lot about journalism and nothing about defense, and I've got a retired colonel who knows everything about the army and not much about journalism. What should I do? And I said, Frank, it's easy, you give the job to me, because I won't be biased in favor of the army. So Frank said, well, would you consider being just called defense reporter for a bit and see how it goes? And rather bravely, I said, no, Frank, I'd have no credibility if I walk into the MOD and say I'm a defense reporter. You've either got to gamble on me or not. So he did, and I got that job. And I was incredibly lucky because it was the time of CND, it was the time of cruise missiles, getting the Trident from the Americans, and also, of course, the Falklands War. So in the Falklands War, I wasn't allowed to go to the Falklands, but I did all the coverage from London. Mm-hmm. And it was my brief moment of, I suppose, fame, because anyone who could tell the difference between a frigate and a destroyer was being immediately contacted by all the radio stations, BBC. So I spent an awful lot of time doing that kind of stuff during the Falklands. And it was really, really interesting covering it from London, an astonishing moment. And then, and I've come to the end of this tale soon, having done that, I rather cheekily took a little time off and went to Scotland. And when I got back, the whole Sunday Times was in uproar because the Washington correspondent, Henry Brandon, had finally said he was going to retire. Now, Henry Brandon had been appointed there by Ian Fleming after the war, Ian Fleming was the foreign manager of the Sunday Times, and Henry Brannan was initially sent to France, and then he was moved. He'd been already in Washington once. He was moved out there. So he'd been there for nearly 40 years. And so all of these people I mentioned on the 6th floor, all of these distinguished writers, were all longing for him to go so that they could have his job. So anyway, I discovered that Frank Giles wanted to give the job to somebody called Stephen Fay, but Stephen Fay was writing a book about Peter Hall's production of The Ring in Bayreuth, and wouldn't be available for 6 months. So rather cunningly, I went to see Hugo Young, the deputy editor, political editor, and I said, Hugo, look, I go to Washington all the time. Why don't I just go there for 6 months and hold the fort? I don't want the job. I'm very happy in London, but I'll happily hold the fort for 6 months. So I get a call from Frank Giles saying, I don't know, I can't give this to anyone else who's applied. It looks like a second prize, but I'll give you a little bit more money and you can have a flat in Washington, and off you go. So I go off to Washington for 6 months, which is a nice way of doing it because you don't feel under any huge strain because you know it's not your real job. And it was the Reagan administration, and I made friends with them, some of them. And at the end of 6 months, Reagan was debating whether to run again, and I wrote a long piece in the Sunday Times saying that he would. And I was out in Santa Barbara, where Reagan had the great wisdom to have a ranch, because it's a very nice place to go, Santa Barbara, right on the sea in California. And I got back to my hotel, which I think was the Sheraton on the front, and the phone was ringing in my room. And this voice said, oh, it's Andrew Neil here. I've taken over as editor of the Sunday Times. So back to London I go. Out to Washington goes Stephen Fay. But Andrew Neil, being a very different kettle of fish to the old liberal-minded leadership of the Sunday Times, fell out with Stephen quite quickly. And now, from being the outsider who didn't even want the job, and far younger, suddenly now I'm the hot favourite to have it. So Andrew Neil says, will you go back to Washington? So
wow.
That's really... And what do I remember? I mean, just one. In Washington, I had a nice office with but we sent stuff over in those days by telex.
Right. What's telex?
Chattering. You fed it. It was a kind of like a fax machine, but you wrote your copy out, and then they fed it in, and it chattered away when it sent a message back. So it was like a fax, but it came through exactly like that. So that was the way you communicated. There were no mobile phones, obviously. There was, it was really basic stuff. Everything was done by phone and by interviewing people, and I suppose I had a really enjoyable time there. And one trick I learned was that if you're going to go to somewhere like Washington, the first thing you should do is make very good friends with your embassy. Yeah. Because it's hard when you're competing with lots of American journalists who these administration people want to talk to break in. But if you make friends with the ambassador and he has you to dinner, that's where you meet them, and then you can pursue that.
Absolutely. What was your expense accounts like back then? Much healthier than they are now, I'm sure.
It was healthy, yes. I mean, I think, weirdly, I don't think salaries have changed. From the 80s to now, they haven't varied hugely. And I was well paid by then. Yeah, with a good, and I managed to buy a house in Washington, borrowing all the money, 90% from the, from Georgetown, and then 10% from the person selling it to me. Wow! So I had a house in Georgetown. Also, it's quite good to be a bachelor in Washington because Washington has a great deal more women in it than men, and a lot of them are widows, and they need an extra bloke to come to dinner, and that is where you meet interesting people. So, I literally was out to dinner every night, and I used to say I was always going to have one night watching TV, so I would always say no. But otherwise, I think I'd have been out every night. Absolutely.
Let's look at another leap of faith you took, which was to leave newspapers entirely and set up the Week. That must have seemed, with a lovely life and job like that, quite a big, bold move to make.
I left Washington, having done 4 or 5 years, in late '87, and jumped ship and helped start a newspaper called The Sunday Correspondent, and then jumped ship from that eventually briefly to the European, and then to become deputy editor of the Sunday Telegraph, where I had 3 very happy years. Charles Moore was the editor of that at the time, before he went on to edit the Daily. And Frank Johnson, the great sketch writer, was the number 3. And they're both very funny people. So we had 3 very funny years. But what happened? In early 1994, my father died, and Charles Moore said, go and spend some time with your mother. So it was January. So I went up to Pitlochry, where I grew up, and there's not an awful lot to do up there in January. So I went for a walk one day across the hills opposite us, and I thought up the week on that walk. Partly, I suppose, in my mind was the feeling that nothing would ever change at the Telegraph, that Hastings would go on as editing the Daily, Charles Moore would stay on the Sunday. So it's that restlessness of sort of when you get to about 40 that you feel I should be doing something new. But I also thought, what am I doing on the Sunday Telegraph? I go into the office, I read all the papers, I then go into conference, and someone says, did you see that piece in the Mail? And I won't have seen it. So I thought, here are newspapers getting longer and longer, and people's time is getting shorter and shorter, not just because they're working, but also because of their hobbies and everything else. So there's a mismatch here between the growing length of newspapers and people's time. So I thought, what about having something which pulls a digest, which pulls the best stuff together? And then I thought, well, it have to have a bit of character to it. It can't just be bland. The Times says this, the Telegraph said that. So maybe we need to break it up with, and I won't be able to afford many pictures, but I could have houses in there. And we could have some fun with the tabloids. So I thought all of this up. And when I got back to the house, there was a copy of the Observer and a copy of the Mail on Sunday in our little sitting room. And the Mail on Sunday had a piece by John Mortimer, and even then, hunting was a big issue. And John Mortimer, a great friend of mine as he became, but also a sort of lifelong Labour Party member, but very passionate about hunting, had written a piece in the Mail on Sunday defending hunting. So I read his piece, and then I wrote out a summary of it. And in the Observer, there was a piece by Alan Watkins saying that the tabloids were a disgrace and blah, 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 and they distorted debate. So I did that too, and I counted the words. It's about 190. And that is exactly the model for what became the best articles page in the week. So then I did, I suppose, what journalists usually do, which is I got back to London and just kind of thought this is a good idea and talked to people about it and didn't do much. And I thought, if I don't do something, I'll never do this, if I don't make myself. So I went to see Charles, well, it's now, I suppose, April. And I said, Charles, I'm going to leave. I've got a project I want to do. I don't want to talk too much about it or I'll jinx it, but I just feel I want to do this thing. It's a magazine. And Charles sort of said, well, you can't go now. And I said, well, I don't need to go now, but 6 months, because that was my notice period. So anyway, Charles did his best to persuade me and said, wouldn't I miss going to the Tory party conference every year? And I said, no, not really. No, not hugely. So anyway, after about 4 months, I was in Scotland, and he rang me up where I was staying and said he was staying somewhere in Perthshire. I should come and stay with him, and let's let Frank Johnson see if he could run the paper when he was away. So that happened, and I then left. So I've left. I've got one child aged 3 and one child just born. I've got no salary. I've got absolutely zero idea how to make this thing work. So what I do is I think, well, venture capital. I'll write to lots of, rich people and see if they'll invest. And none of them wanted to. They were neither adventurous nor willing to put up any capital. So I spent 3 months of the September, October, November struggling around trying to raise money, going back and forth to London and wondering how on earth I would do it. And then through a guy who'd just become a Labour MP called Michael Wills, and who had been my sort of producer when I did stuff with Brown Walden on Weekend World during the Falklands and Post, said, I've got a friend called John Gordon, go and see him. He's quite enterprising. So this guy, John Gordon, had a company called the Register Group in Islington, which monitored advertising. So I went to see him, and he said, I like your idea, but make it cheaper. Don't do it as a glossy mag, and do it more like a newsletter, lower production values. And you can do a dummy here. And, oh, by the way, I've got a friend who's never done very much work before, but he's clever, called Jeremy O'Grady. Go and see him and see if you can persuade him to stop writing learned pieces and come and... So I did. And I went to saw Jeremy O'Grady in Holland Park. He and I, with a little bit of help from one or two other people I knew, did a dummy in John Gordon's office, which was the first dummy of the week, and almost had a friend called Will Ellsworth-Jones who had been on the Sunday Times with me, and he helped a bit too, and it was his idea. It must be true, I read it in the tabloids, that was his idea for it. And Boring But Important was another of his. So all of those things were there. So having done that, we then have to address again the question of money. And John Gordon said that he would invest, but he wanted a huge percentage. One of the few wise things I did was I said no to that. And in the end, we sold our house in London, and I put some of that in, and I got friends and family to put in the rest. So I raised just under 200,000. I found a little office near Paddington in Junction Mews, which was so small, a third of the size of this room, but it had a nice mews, and it was a very sunny summer, the summer of 1995, so we had a lot of our meetings outside in the... And anyway, we launched in late May, 30 years ago, almost exactly to now, and basically what we did was in those days, again, it's so difficult now where you find readers. Maybe you find them, as I do, through the knowledge, through podcasts a bit, or through social media. But then there was one, and only really one, simple way, which was direct mail. So what you did was you rang up the Spectator, and you said, can we try your list? And you bought 1,000 names from the Spectator, or the Economist. We did both. You would then send out a flyer saying, of the week, or even a free copy, and you would see what percentage take-up you got from that 1,000 names. And if you got over 1.5%, you roll out the list. That was basically the rule of thumb. So we did quite well. We chose our, but it was a struggle because the week required quite a few people, and that money wasn't very much. So I had a friend of mine in Chip and I said when I was starting it, he said, you need somebody to organize your office. I've got just the man for you. He's called Brigadier General Clendon Drooks, and he's very efficient. So I hired Brigadier General Clendon Drooks, and he was very efficient. He stopped us putting newspapers all over the floor. He made everybody tidy up. He kept an eagle eye on the numbers, and he generally bossed us all around, and it was very essential. And anyway, so he said, John, these numbers, you're going to have to think about this. And at almost the same moment, I got this postcard arriving in Junction Mews. Dear John, I like your magazine. Somebody gave it to me. I might even be prepared to invest. Give me a ring if you're interested. Yours, sincerely, Felix Dennis. So I waved this thing round the office and said, anybody heard of Felix Dennis? And I don't think anybody had, even although he'd done, Viz and so on. No, not Viz, Oz. But the money was depleting. I talked to John Brown, who did run Viz, and he said that he didn't particularly want to invest in this. So in the end, I trotted off to see Felix in his office, and he just launched something called Maxim, which was that men's magazine, slightly more salubrious than Playboy or Penthouse, but a bit more, less so than GQ. And it was doing really well, and doing really well in America. So he was sort of, lots of wild hair and very enthusiastic and waving his arms around and talking us through all the money he'd made and telling me details about his sex life, which, neither me nor the girl who was with me, who went on to publish Sainsbury's magazine, did we really want to know that he hadn't done any penetrative sex for 2 years? Not especially, but this was coming at us in a torrent of Felix Dennis style stuff. So at the end he said, so, John, if you want me to do anything, just come and see me and we'll have another meeting. So I thought, well, I then bumped into John Brown again and he said, oh, Felix is perfect for you, go and see him in the country and do some deal. So I went to see him in the country. He lived in a nice manor house near Stratford. It was, again, a hot summer day. We sat in the garden and I did what was probably an amazingly stupid deal by saying, you can have 30% if you put in 300,000. It's astonishing how naive journalists can be about money. If you don't cover business all the time, and I think I don't think I really understood. What I should have said was, we'll go 50-50 and you do loan stock, which is you put in some money and we pay it back, and it doesn't matter what the equity price is. But anyway, he more or less bit my hand off to say, fine. So he put in 300,000. And, to be fair to Felix, he was a master at the art of direct mail. To him it was a science, not an art, and he really worked it out. So we benefited immediately from Dennis Publishing with all their experience and things like Maxim. And the week, we began to just spend money more cleverly, and it was a much more uneven keel. But they weren't unhappy to spend money because they wanted us to run out reasonably quickly, or Felix did, which we did. So in another 6 months, I was back in his office and saying I needed more. And he said, well, you can have more, but I want a majority. So I gave away a majority. But at that point, after that, Felix was good, because he then put in what we needed, and we needed astonishing now, if you think about it. But it only took £1.5 million to get the week into profit. It took a number of years, but it took £1.5 million here in Britain. So
wow.
that was the birth of the week. And I did everything kind of very, hiring people astonishingly quickly. I can tell this story because one of the people I had was called Susanna Gross, whose mother I'd worked with on the Sunday Telegraph. And when I did a little book of my week letters, she told me I had to put the story in. Anyway, I said to her when I interviewed her, I said, okay, you can have the job. I said, you realize that I've hired you entirely for your looks, don't you? She looked very pleased. And I said it was a joke. I don't have time to judge you on anything else. But it was more or less true. I had to kind of move very quickly at the beginning. Anyway, Susanna said, you must put that story in the book. So anyway, it was all done, as I say, in a slightly chaotic way, but people like Susanna and Jemima Lewis, who's now moved back to Telegraph, and they were all really important because they were much younger than Jeremy and I. And so we brought in quite a lot of youth. Yeah. So it was a mixture of youth. Anyway, after that, it was a hard grind, going back to your thing, just getting those numbers up. It took 7 years till we made a proper profit and we paid off our debt. But it was steady growth, sort of 10,000 a year until we reached 150,000.
Wow.
And so that was really it.
Yeah. And then the most remarkable thing about the week in many ways is how over those 30 years, the actual format has scarcely changed from issue one, the flow of it, which is kind of the genius of the week, that it really takes you through different elements of the world and of politics and media. Was that very deliberate not to change it? And do you think often now media entities prize novelty and newness and changing things all the time?
Yes, you have to remember that magazines like The Economist and The Spectator have been around a very long time. The Week has been now around for 30 years, but I was very resistant to making, I had, you're right, partly through luck and partly through doing a lot of thinking, I think I had a pretty robust formula. So I wasn't going to fiddle around with it. And, people liked the properties where they were. They didn't want them right up at the front. They liked the tabloids thing. They liked it. So I tried to make it a mix of sort of serious stuff and reward reading. good week for and bad week for, all of those sort of fun bits, but mixed up with the serious bits, so that it was quite a jolly read. And also the other thing, I didn't want it to be overly depressing. One of the problems of newspapers, and indeed, when you're watching the news on TV, it's incredibly depressing. It's something I've taken into the knowledge, is that one should not always be looking on the dark side. And I think the final point is it's important for any magazine, or indeed, I think, newsletter, to have a heart, that although you can be doing what we did do on the week, which is pulling all sorts of different things, readers have got to know that the magazine has a heart. They roughly, it's like a friend that they know, that it's not going to lead them astray, it's not going to sell them very stupid ideas, or that it will obviously try and broaden everyone's mind, but it will have a heart.
Definitely.
And so therefore, I think it was important to stick with the formula.
Yeah, absolutely. The rise of the week coincided with the rise of something else, the internet, of course, which I think back then was seen as kind of a golden opportunity for press. And they thought, wow, this is international reach and infinite eyeballs. And it seemed like this was going to make people even more money. That very quickly turned out not to be the case for media. Where do you think we went wrong with the media? Why didn't we use the internet to save and promote newspapers, and why did it end up eating them in so many ways?
Well, it wasn't a conscious process, of course. I mean, the internet grew through people who were trying to make money out of it, as social media has grown through people trying to make money out of it. So they weren't remotely interested in the future of newspapers. If anything, they wanted to supplant them from the beginning. So it's all become about eyes on the page and finding ways to do that. So the sort of old, what you might call integrity of newspapers and the mediation of it all began to disappear when the internet came along. And it's obviously accelerated and happened much more with social media. I mean, there was, I think it was important, going back to those old Sunday Times days and even the days in the early days of the week, that the whole mediation thing, that you did have an intelligent go-between who was, say, talking to government or talking to people and then passing it on, so it was filtered. Whereas now you've got a thousand flowers bloom, everybody just spouts off about everything, but that isn't actually making people better informed.
No.
It's simply making them more polarized, and it's enabling social media companies to make more money by just feeding them stuff that they think they'll want. So it's a sort of opposite.
Yeah.
So in a way, the internet has always had an opposite agenda, I think, to that having a heart and being a newspaper and being something that is your friend.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk to us about the knowledge then, which of course is principally an email newsletter. How did you come up with that idea, and why did you decide to go digital after so many years in print?
Well, when Felix Dennis died, the week I knew would be sold, and I looked quite hard to find a trade buyer, because I wanted a trade buyer because I thought they would be much more sympathetic, and I didn't really want to work for private equity. I talked to Mike Bloomberg, I talked to the CEO of The Economist and the New York Times, and eventually Jonathan Rothermere was interested in DMG, and they put in a bid for it, but they lost to a private equity company called Exponent. Now, private equity did what they always do, which is they want to cut costs and push up prices. So I'm a big cost. I've done it for quite a long time, goodness. And so in the end, I decided I ought to. I'd had 25 years in it, so I left. And Jonathan Rothermere rang me up and he said, well, do you want to compete? So I thought about it, and I rang back and I said, well, I don't want to compete, but I do think maybe, the world has moved on, people are absorbing things in a different way, maybe I could do something digital. And that's really where the knowledge grew. So my daughter helped me, Flora, quite a lot, and we actually, just at the end of lockdown, we were thinking about it. It took, again, a while, to the sort of gestation period. But just the feeling was that people, especially younger people, wanted stuff much more instantly. The week suited its time as a rhythm, but now I felt it had to be sort of daily. So really and we started trying to do too much. I don't think I got the knowledge right at the beginning, because I did try to do a weekly edition and stuff on the website, but I quickly realized that you've got to do one thing and do it well in the web. And I think you asked me earlier, what about a podcast?
Yeah.
I think someday we ought to do one, but at the moment, my belief is we should just try and get the newsletter right and build on that, and eventually we probably will do other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you sort of measure what people really love in the knowledge, and what elements do people seem to respond best to? And is it similar to the things that they loved at the week?
Yes, I think so. Obviously, word of mouth has always been important. It was totally important on the week, building it up. I mean, for all the marketing one does. And it's the same with the knowledge. Word of mouth is the thing that carries it. And I think people like it because it has that mixture of serious stuff explained, which with not just a total focus on Britain, but quite a lot of international stuff, but not making you want to slit your wrists at the end of each issue. So we always have a jolly quote, and we look for funny stuff and jokes and good bits of gossip, because that's what makes the world go round. So it's a sort of, I think it's getting that balance. That's what I try to do with the knowledge. And again, to give it some heart so that people feel that it's like a friend.
Absolutely. And are you still very much the editorial voice at the top of it? And if so, how do you read so much and assimilate so much different bits and pieces?
Because it's not just, I've got a clever little team who I know well, and Harry Byford used to work on the Week, and we think quite alike. So we've all got a sort of similar approach to the world. And when we hire new people, you can always tell if they're going to sort of work out, if they've got the capacity. It's not an easy thing doing this digesting stuff. It looks easy, but it's bloody difficult. And we really struggled at the Week finding people, which is why I was always terrified of losing people, because the trick of doing it, you need to have not too much ego so that you're doing justice to the other person who you're writing, but also enough to make it characterful. And it's a tricky balance. Also, it's hardly glamorous, always sitting in an office reading other people's stuff and then redoing it. You're not going out for lunch with the Prime Minister, or it's kind of a difficult. So I think that the little team I've got, we all do things.
Yeah.
Not exactly alike, of course, and there's good, healthy arguments go on, but I suppose I shape it. But
yeah. Absolutely. But what's your sort of reading diet? Do you read 3 newspapers every morning, listen to 5 podcasts?
I do slightly erratically, like we all do, listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
I don't think we do enough of it, by the way. I think we should have more podcast stuff in the knowledge. I tend to start with the Times, because I always think the Times is a bit, and John Witherell, who used to edit it, said that he slightly drew from what I did on the Week to try and, because he gets lots of views in there.
Oh, wow.
But then otherwise I scatter about, and I'm quite sort of, fickle. And so I'll mix it. I'll read stuff like Bloomberg and the New York Times, but I'll also read The Spectator, which is quite on the ball, and the New Statesman and The Guardian. And, we've always found it, and we found this at the Week too, it's often harder getting really interesting stuff from The Guardian than it is from, say, The Times, because it's slightly more one track. The Telegraph is a little bit like that too. We slightly look, because what we're looking for is views which are a little bit surprising and not just totally predictable. So having a piece saying that Starmer doesn't really believe in stopping immigration is a bit obvious for us. You need some sort of spin on it, I think.
One thing I've always wondered about the Week is, especially early on, did the newspapers mind that perhaps you were almost cannibalizing their work? Were the writers seeing their name in print reduced to 100 words and furious about that?
One of my most shaming moments was in the very early days of the Week. I stuck on the back cover a photograph of a fan of British newspapers saying, "Why bother with all these when you can read this?" The fury I got from all my friends, it was the most tactless and stupid thing I could
But there's a truth to it.
But there's a truth to it. But obviously I dropped that really, really quickly. But individual journalists would say, oh, why don't you feature me more on the best articles page? And,
Yeah.
and you know, occasionally travel writers who were sometimes scraping around would want to pay them. And eventually we did have to pay a little bit to some newspapers for some stuff, because we were flirting with copyright, I think. But a lot of journalists liked to be
Yeah.
in. And I think a lot of journalists like to be in the knowledge. They like to see, you know, it's particularly now when newspapers are struggling, if you showcase something to 150,000 readers, then
Yeah.
more likely to go and read that paper.
Absolutely. The Knowledge, of course, is an email newsletter. I think newsletter is not a very good word. It's not very sexy. It doesn't really sort of sum up what they are.
No.
Can we think of a better term for newsletter?
Well, I haven't thought of a better term, but I agree that it is
Yeah.
sort of. I know it sounds like it's very functional. And
It sounds like a church
form,
circular or something,
but
or
I'm
a
not
parish.
quite sure. You can't really call it a magazine or a.
No.
I don't know how you. I agree that some thoughts
Yeah.
needed as to how you do that, but I don't know.
And I guess my part B to that question then is, what other delivery systems, for want of a better word, could we use to get sort of news and stories out there? Do you think there's a great WhatsApp newsletter? Don't steal that idea, actually, that's quite good. Do you think there's a great WhatsApp delivery system or something else entirely that we haven't discovered yet?
Well, there probably is. I mean, WhatsApp, after all, if these groups are created very easily,
Yeah.
maybe that is that. And I bang on about the awfulness of social media, but we obviously, if we can get anything with traction on TikTok or YouTube or indeed anywhere else.
So do you do
we
TikTok
will.
stuff?
Yeah,
on
we
Knowledge?
put a little website, of course.
It-
But it's not totally our audience, but you get some.
Yeah,
Part of it is just getting known.
absolutely.
So maybe you should start the WhatsApp.
Maybe I should.
I should nick that idea.
You should. So let's look forward then a little bit more. What makes you optimistic, having worked through two, I think, really quite defining ages of media, the print age and now the digital age? What makes you optimistic looking forward about media?
Well, I think you're right. Things go in phases, and it may well be that we are reaching a point where people will go back a bit more to wanting serious stuff. And that may also be true in the world of books, where people may feel the pleasure of going back and reading great novels is something that they've been missing out on. And already, even on TikTok, Jane Austen is quite popular.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a move there. And I think, just as a lot of things are now being questioned, I suspect there may just be a bit of resistance. Already, a lot of schools are banning mobiles.
Yeah.
I met somebody the other day who's a banker and who had recently become chairman of a group of academy schools, and he gathered together the head teachers from these schools when he arrived, and he said, I want you to ban mobile phones in all your schools. And they said, we can't do that. We'll lose a lot of our pupils. He said, I've made a lot of money. Any pupil you lose, I will, out of my own pocket, refund you for that. They didn't lose a single pupil across all the schools. And this guy also paid for little purses which would go inside the school doors so that kids could leave their phone in that, and then if they were walking home, they could take it out of that and walk with it.
Wow.
So I think that is the beginning of realization that children spending their life addicted to mobiles is not a good thing. So I think the tide will turn a bit on that.
Yeah.
And as I say, all sorts of other things are being challenged, the whole kind of wokeness agenda and everything else, and it's all part of it, I think, that we may go back. People may just discover that longer pieces written by journalists, after all, a lot of blogs work quite well. I mean, something like Substack is doing well. I mean, you ask what I read, I always read Andrew Sullivan every week. And he writes very intelligently about Trump. He didn't like Biden, but he doesn't like Trump either, but he recognizes the good side of him. And, so I think more, what we slightly have lost is nuance and the kind of, seeing things from different angles. And I think maybe that the internet in the end can come around in full circle and we can get a bit of that back.
Absolutely, we hope so. Should we go out to the audience then and ask some questions on that note? Anyone got any burning questions for Jon? No, this gentleman here. Wonderful.
Thank you for a splendid conversation, both of you. And I entered the world of publishing at the age of 70 for reasons I won't particularly go into just now.
70?
70.
Wow.
6 years ago, knowing nothing about publishing earlier, on the basis that a whole generation growing up without the capacity to think about substantial issues is not going to deliver the future of mankind. And that the people who are going to deliver the future of mankind, whatever they may believe, will only be able to reach that position if they develop the capacity to think properly, which does involve reading longer stuff in a world that's going more and more complex every day. But I don't find people making that argument. Would it help the swing of the pendulum back, which you've just referred to in your concluding moments, would it help the swing back if more people made that argument? I haven't made the argument myself, I must confess, but
yes,
would it?
It would. It's absolutely, you're completely right.
I think that's what James Marriott was doing this morning,
Yes,
actually.
it was.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a little side thing that I do, which I think of more like a charity called Connell Guides, where I've done these guides to classic novels, from Pride and Prejudice to Middlemarch to a lot of modern novels, and also to Shakespeare's plays and so on. And they're popular in schools, because what they're doing is they're telling you what the critics say about these, in a sort of weak style, and they're clever academics who are writing them. But I suppose my point is that, particularly with the novel, is if you want to have that capacity to think deeply and understand other people, apart from knowing about current affairs, you have to read novels. It is the only way that you will understand other people, because we don't sit here talking about what we're thinking or the sort of. You have to get inside the minds of people. You have to read novels, and that means long-form reading. And I think it's a great loss when now schools will only allow you to give you short books to read and so on. And so I think it's all part and parcel of it. It's not just in the current affairs world, it's also in the cultural world. People understanding history and English. And after all, for Britain, these are the two key subjects, aren't they, English and history? Understanding our past, and not just dismissing it and saying the empire was awful and we're full of white privilege. It's kind of, it's understanding that there were good things as well as bad things. And it's understanding that we have the most astonishing literary heritage of any country ever. And you know, the capacity, the willingness to trash that and to say, oh, well, Shakespeare's passé and, you know, we have to have trigger warnings on everything. It's just bonkers. So I think you're right. I think there will be a move back towards this. I hope so. And whatever I can do with things like Connell Guides, I'll do, and you should do too.
What do you do in publishing now
you
you've just joined it?
I have two imprints. One focuses, as you might imagine, given my appearance, on India, anything to do with India and people of Indian origin abroad, which is quite a large audience and quite a large subject area. And the second area is completely unlike, and that is global challenges. So anything in the area of climate change, the ethics of technology, reforming the United Nations, how do we develop a financial system that is fit for purpose in a world of artificial intelligence, which is going to be speeded up no end by quantum computing? How do we prepare for the kind of world that's coming? And not coming in 100 years or even 10 years, but probably much faster than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's... there's one other thing I do, sorry.
No, please.
Just advertising all the things I do. But I do something called Sunday Briefing, which I do with somebody called Keith Craig, who used to run an outfit called Hacklet, and it's basically ex-intelligence people. But that's totally different to the week and the knowledge. And what that is doing is it's aimed at CEOs, and we charge quite a lot, but it's trying to identify the trends which will shape the world, but in climate, in the future of capitalism, in relations with places like China, and the whole AI. So it's just looking at those things and trying to look ahead and see what the trends are.
Absolutely.
We should talk further
Yes,
about all
should.
that.
Look at this. We'll take a cut. I think this lady here got a question.
Hi, yeah. Thank you for the talk. I had a few questions actually about the business side, because you've recently set it up in 2022, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How did you grow so fast to 140,000 readers? What was the main driver?
Well, it's very nice of you to say that we've grown so fast, and we have. But whereas with the week, everybody who we were growing with was paying money to us.
Yes.
The only way to do it nowadays is to get in people free. Which is, very nice in terms of numbers, but not. But then you have to try and, balance that out with the fact that it's expensive to get them, and then you have to offset it. So we have grown fast. We've grown fast. Two main sources. The first, podcasts. The Rest is Politics was incredibly helpful to us. Okay. They were I know them both, and they were really helpful to me. And also, we paid them a little. And it's too expensive for me to advertise with them now. But they were in the early days. We've got a lot of readers. And The Rest is History. Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland, they were really helpful. So those podcasts, and now I'm afraid we rely, like everyone else, mainly on social media, because I can't really think, there's not much point in advertising media and other media, except possibly for podcasts. And how do we make money out of it? Well, we have ads, but we don't want to have more than one a day, because it'll spoil it. And two, we encourage people to subscribe for 40 quid a year, which is much less than the week would cost. And gradually we're nudging that subscription number up and trying not to lose. So we give part of the newsletter to most people and the whole to those who subscribe. Okay.
Would you be able to share what sort of percentage of paid subscribers you have now?
Yes, it's normally when you try and get subscribers from something like this, you get a tiny percentage. It's something like 1.5%, 2.5%. We've got over 6%, maybe. Okay. Yeah, and we're nudging that up all the time.
Okay, thank you.
Not bad.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Any more questions? Harry Jarman, you had your hand up a moment ago. The Felix Dennis of 2025 in many ways.
I was just in terms of the future, and that obviously everyone's watching more video now. Do you think there's a happy medium between the written word and video, or do you think we're all going to become very stupid and just watch stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased, of course, because I've always favoured the written word for absorbing current affairs type information. Partly because if you sit down to watch the 10 o'clock news, you watch it in their order. They are dictating to you exactly. You can't skip forward because you're not interested in their top story. Whereas if you buy the Times and you don't like the front page story, you move on. So you have much more capacity to make choice. I realize with video that you can scroll forward and so on, but I don't know. I feel, that there should be more attention to the written word and less attention to video. And I think that we should be looking at videos and indeed TV more for entertainment than for news would be my feeling. But then I'm biased, as I say, because that's the world I've grown up in.
Wonderful. There was a few more hands in the air. There's got one here. Yes.
Again, thank you for a great talk. Firstly, do you consume sort of newspapers in print or online?
It's a very good question. Do you know, I try to do a mixture because I can't possibly have lots of newspapers all over the house. So I tend to buy a couple, like I might buy, and sometimes on Sunday I would buy the Observer, but I often buy the Telegraph partly because I like the crossword, and I buy the Times because I read it quite carefully. But everything else I read online. Because it's just, it's so easy. And also because we have a sort of office subscription online, so it's just easier to absorb. And also you can't, in a way, life is much easier than when we did the week, because when we did the week and we had the foreign page, someone would have to buy Le Monde and translate it. So we need, and same with the Italian or the Spanish papers. Now, we can get it all online, and it can all be translated for us. So we can do absolutely everything without moving. So there are benefits of the internet. So that's basically how I do it.
Sure. And also, do you think that consumption of news and opinions has become more conscious or less conscious?
You mean by more conscious? That
Like, are people seeking it out more, or is it more being fed to them than it was when you started the week?
I think it's the latter. I think it's more being fed to them, because, as I say, so much is done through algorithms, and because these companies are trying to make money, so they want to feed you what they think you will look at, and because I think that what you were talking about, and people's capacity to evaluate stuff and to think deeply about things is disappearing. So I think it's more being fed rather than being challenged to see more than one point of view. Again, something which is often easier to do in print than on video, where you can get lots of different points of view. You can do it on video too, but I don't think that happens enough.
Great, thank you. There's 2 questions over here. The gentleman in the denim shirt.
So I was just going to ask, in terms of following on from that question, leading people intentionally back to longer form content, how do you think the media or publication houses are going to be able to do that, and get people getting that motivation to go back to longer form content for younger generations?
Great question. That's the big one.
It is a good question, and I don't think I know the answer, but I do think, as I mentioned Substack, and I think that is a good development, and I think we need a British, maybe the knowledge eventually can do something like that, where you are getting clever people who you become addicted to and like to follow to give you a long-form opinion every week. And so I think that actually that's one form. I very much doubt it'll come back through sort of newspaper type, partly because of the costs. Again, the week now costs much more to post because of postage and much more to print than it used to. And so I think everything is mitigating, is militating against print style on paper. But, I think, as I say, things like Substack are a good sign.
Definitely.
That was easy. Thank you so much. I have a question on the role of brands. So obviously we're in the room with Polestar today. What is the responsibility of brands to defend long-form premium journalism?
You mean of advertising brands? Well, they probably wouldn't see it that way, I would have thought, but maybe in some cases they like being associated with things which they think are clever and which are informing people, and so I think there might be, with our advertisers, we provide an environment a sophisticated environment where they think this is where we want to get our customers from. So it's a mutual thing, I think. I think we benefit them and they benefit us. But it wouldn't work unless they were getting a good response from us. But on the whole, our advertisers seem to like us. So I think it's not necessarily their responsibility, but I'm pleased that they're there.
Absolutely. And we're very pleased they're here as well with us today, especially
Exactly.
Polestar. Any more questions? There was a couple more hands. There's one right at the back. There we go.
Thank you very much. Yesterday we had Matthew Freud speak, and he mentioned that he thought that we were living in the strongest age of disinterest from the public, simply because of the huge amount of information that's being fed to everyone, not even on an hour-by-hour basis, but on a minute-by-minute basis in some cases, and the huge amount of sort of macro information that we're being fed rather than local, regional news. And obviously that's the view of a PR, and I'm just interested to hear the view from the other side.
Yeah, it's a very interesting view, and he's probably right. I mean, what would I say to that? I think he probably is right. We are bombarded endlessly, so it's very difficult to know whether you're coming or going. On the other hand, there's a reason that Farage is doing well, and it's not just because he's a little England or anything like that. I mean, what one notices about Farage is that he's very, very quick to change if he needs to. And it's interesting that for all his stuff about, I don't want LGBT flags flying in local councils and, etc. there was an awful lot of stress on the councils that they won about we must collect the bins and we must the stuff which people really want. So I think that although there is disinterest, I think people are viscerally fed up both with the Tories and with Labour, with the main parties and the cock-up that's been made of the country, and the fact that, you know, that they don't buy all this. They don't buy net zero, they don't buy workism, and they don't... And I think that where reform is coming through is, obviously people don't exactly know what they do, but they are beginning to stress that they're interested in working class communities that, in a way that Labour doesn't seem to be, and that they're interested in basic things like collecting bins. So I think there is a level of interest in the fact that people feel that Britain is being incompetently run, and it's a sort of amorphous feeling. People can't quite think why, but they think that, you know, these politicians just really aren't up to much. You know, and in a way, what was tragic about 2019 is that Boris was somebody that the country fell for, but then he didn't appear to have the concentration span or anything to actually see it through or do what he promised. And now we have a government which, you know, people are inevitably sceptical about because they don't see how it's going to make things any better. And reform, as Rod Little said on Sunday, is driving a wedge through the middle of Labour because in the Red Wall, they don't like immigration, they don't like workism, they don't like net zero, so they're probably going to go to reform rather than vote for Labour again. And in the South, they don't much like Labour either, so they're going to desert to the Greens and the Lib Dems. So it's a real problem. So I think there is disinterest, but it's partly through disillusionment, I think, that's, rather than disinterest.
Absolutely. Complex times.
But I do think just one final point on this long form. It's encouraging in a way that newspapers like the Times and the FT and the Telegraph are doing quite well on their subscription models. You know, that they are getting people to subscribe to them, you know, and so the numbers are not doing too bad.
Absolutely. Well, we hope they continue to exist, but we hope especially that the weak and the knowledge continue to exist, because they're brilliant things to helping us work out these very difficult and changing times. But thank you. I just want to say thanks to Jon, and thanks to all of you for coming. Let's have a little round of applause for a wonderful speaker, Jon Connell. Thanks,
Thank you, I
guys.
enjoyed it.
Wonderful.